The vibration of the phone against the granite countertop sounded like a bone-dry cough. I didn't look at it. I was busy adjusting the silk tie at my throat, ensuring the knot was as symmetrical and unyielding as a structural joint. In my profession, precision is the difference between a soaring atrium and a pile of shattered glass. I treat my mornings with the same architectural rigor. It was 7:14 a.m. Leo's graduation ceremony was scheduled for 10. Outside the window of my townhouse, the Midwestern sun was already baking the asphalt of our quiet street, a heat that promised to make the stadium benches unbearable by noon. The phone buzzed again, then a third time. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a telemarketer or the chirp of a work notification. It was the frantic, staccato vibration of a crisis. I picked it up. "Leo? Dad?" His voice was thin, vibrating at a frequency that set my teeth on edge. He sounded small, which was a feat for a young man who had spent the last year captaining a rowing crew and maintaining a 4.1 GPA. "It's gone. I don't know what happened. I left it on the chair in the hallway last night. I stayed at Mom's because she insisted on the family breakfast. And now it's... Dad, I can't go out there like this." "Slow down," I said, my voice dropping into the low, resonant register I used when a contractor told me the steel beams were delayed. "What is gone?" "The gown, the stole, the valedictorian cords, everything." There was a ragged sound on the other end, the sound of a controlled young man losing his grip. "It's been shredded, Dad, not just torn. It looks like someone took a pair of heavy shears to it. It's in 100 pieces on the floor." I looked at my own reflection. My face remained a mask of professional neutrality, but behind my eyes, the blueprints were shifting. I knew that house. I had designed the renovation of the master suite 3 years before the marriage collapsed. I knew the layout of the hallway, the height of the chair, and the fact that the only other person in that house last night was Lydia. "Where is your mother?" I asked. "She's at the bakery picking up the celebration cake," Leo said, and I could hear the bitter irony beginning to seep through his shock. "She left a note. She said she was so sorry she wasn't there when I discovered the accident. She suggested the dog might have gotten to it. Dad, we don't have a dog. The neighbor's golden retriever hasn't been in this house for 6 months." "Go to the bathroom, splash some water on your face, and pack your bag," I said. "Do not argue with her when she gets back. Do not show her you've been crying. Take the back way out through the garden gate. I'll meet you at the corner of Elm and Mason in 10 minutes. I'm coming to get you." I hung up and grabbed my jacket. My hands were perfectly steady. The drive to the old neighborhood took 6 minutes. I spent that time calculating. Lydia's boutique was failing. The public records I'd quietly monitored showed 3 months of arrears on her commercial lease. Her resentment toward me had always been a cold, simmering thing, but her resentment toward Leo's success, the way he reminded her of my discipline and my refusal to engage in her theater, had turned into something sharper. To ruin his moment of triumph was, in her mind, the ultimate strike against the legacy I was trying to build for him. I saw Leo standing on the corner, a duffel bag slumped at his feet. He looked fragile in the harsh morning light. As he climbed into the passenger seat, the smell of burnt synthetic fabric clung to his shirt. "She did it," he whispered, staring straight through the windshield. "She sat there and watched me hang it up last night. She hugged me and told me how proud she was. And then she waited until I was asleep." I pulled away from the curb. "I know. How can she do that? It's just a piece of fabric, but it's the point of it. It isn't about the fabric, Leo. It's about the optics. She wants you to walk onto that stage looking disheveled, or better yet, she wants you to refuse to go at all so she can spend the afternoon playing the role of the grieving mother whose son had a breakdown under the pressure I put on him. It's a narrative. She's been writing it for years." I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. I didn't hand it to him. It was my private log, a habit from the firm, documenting every site visit, every deviation from the plan, every structural flaw. For 2 years, I had been documenting Lydia, not the shouting matches, there weren't many of those, but the quiet sabotages, the misplaced tuition checks, the forgotten medical appointments, the subtle ways she tried to erode the foundation of our son's future. "We aren't going to let her write the ending," I said. We arrived at the high school. The parking lot was already a sea of SUVs and families in pastel sundresses. I saw the principal, Miller, standing near the gate, looking harried. He was an old contact. I'd designed the new science wing pro bono 5 years ago. "Stay here," I told Leo. I approached Miller. I didn't lead with the drama. I led with the solution. "Arthur, we have a minor logistical catastrophe. Leo's gown was destroyed this morning, an accident with some cleaning chemicals. Do you have a spare in the faculty office? Size medium long?" Miller blinked, his brow furrowed. Silas, for the valedictorian? We usually keep a few backups for the scholarship kids who can't afford the rental fee. Let me check the supply closet in the gym. 10 minutes later, I returned to the car with a heavy plastic bag. Leo looked up, a spark of hope finally cutting through the gloom. Get changed in the back seat, I said, and Leo, give me the note she left. He reached into his pocket and handed me a crumpled piece of floral stationery. I smoothed it out on the dashboard. Oh, Leo, I saw the mess in the hall. My heart is breaking for you. I tried to see if it could be pinned back together, but it's just ruined. Maybe this is a sign that we're all pushing too hard. Don't worry about the ceremony. We can just have a nice lunch at home. Love, Mom. I read it twice. It wasn't just a note, it was a confession of intent. She hadn't asked how it happened. She hadn't offered to drive him to find a replacement. She had immediately jumped to the conclusion of ruined and staying home. Dad? Leo was zipping up the black polyester gown. He looked like himself again, tall, capable, and focused. What are we going to do? You are going to give the best speech this school has heard in a decade, I said. You are going to walk across that stage with your head high, and I am going to ensure that everyone sees exactly what kind of accident happened this morning. You're going to talk to her? No, I said, a cold, hard certainty settling into my chest. I'm an architect, Leo. I don't fix things by shouting at the cracks. I fix them by reinforcing the structure and removing the rot. I looked at the stadium. My firm had been a major donor for the new digital scoreboard and the integrated AV system. I knew the technicians. I knew the override codes for the media feed. I had spent 20 years building things that lasted, and Lydia had spent 20 years trying to find the flaws in my work. As we walked toward the student entrance, I saw Lydia's car pull into the VIP lot. She stepped out, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a dress that screamed maternal elegance. She looked radiant, the picture of a supportive parent. She didn't see us. She was too busy checking her reflection in the car window, practicing her somber, sympathetic face. I felt a surge of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel during the entirety of our divorce, a pure, crystalline sense of purpose. Go, I told Leo, giving him a firm pat on the shoulder. I'll be in the stands. Watch the big screen before you start your speech. I've prepared a little introductory montage for the graduates. I think it's important we show the journey it took to get here. Leo looked at me, a question forming in his eyes. He saw the look on my face, the one I had when I was calculating the load-bearing capacity of a cantilevered balcony, and he simply nodded. He knew I didn't make mistakes. I made my way to the sound booth behind the bleachers. The young man inside, a junior named Toby who had interned at my office last summer, looked up with a grin. Hey, Mr. Vance, ready for the big show? Ready, Toby, I said, sliding a thumb drive onto the console. I have those high-res renders of the new campus layout we discussed. I thought we'd run them during the processional, and I added a few candid photos of the valedictorian's journey to the podium, just to add a personal touch. Awesome, Toby said, his fingers dancing over the touchscreen. I'll cue them up right after the national anthem. I stepped out of the booth and found my seat. I was 3 rows behind Lydia. I could see the back of her neck, the way she tilted her head with a practiced grace as she spoke to the woman next to her. She was likely already telling her about Leo's unfortunate morning and how he was too devastated to attend. The band began the opening march. The sea of black gowns began to flow onto the field. I watched Lydia's posture change. She stiffened as she scanned the rows, her head darting back and forth. She was looking for an empty chair. She was looking for the hole in the formation where her son should have been. Then she saw him. Leo was in the lead, his gold cords gleaming against the black fabric of the spare gown. He was walking with a steady, rhythmic gait. Lydia's hand went to her throat. The woman next to her said something, gesturing toward Leo, and I watched Lydia's shoulders hunch forward as if she'd been struck. Her carefully constructed narrative was already beginning to fray at the edges. But I wasn't done. A structure doesn't collapse from one loose screw. It falls when the entire foundation is revealed to be hollow. I checked my watch. The ceremony was proceeding with agonizing slowness. The speeches from the school board were platitudes wrapped in boredom. I sat perfectly still, my arms crossed, watching the giant digital screen above the end zone. Finally, the principal stood up. And now, to deliver the valedictory address, Leo Vance. The applause was thunderous. Leo stepped to the podium. On the screen behind him, the image shifted. It wasn't the architectural renders I had promised Toby. It was a high-resolution photograph of the floral note Lydia had left on the counter, followed by a crystal-clear shot of the shredded gown lying like a carcass on the hallway floor. The stadium went silent. Not a respectful silence, but a heavy, confused, indrawn breath. I looked at the back of Lydia's head. She didn't move. She couldn't. She was pinned to her seat by the weight of 5,000 pairs of eyes. Leo didn't look at the screen. He looked at the crowd, then he looked at me. I gave him a single infinitesimal nod. Success, Leo began, his voice echoing through the speakers, is often measured by what we build, but today I want to talk about what we survive. I leaned back and let out a slow, quiet breath. The first crack had been formed. Now, all I had to do was watch the rest of the walls come down. The silence that followed the projection of the note was not empty, it was pressurized. It was the kind of silence that precedes the failure of a structural load-bearing wall, where the molecules of the air seem to tighten before the first audible snap. I sat 3 rows behind Lydia, watching the rigid line of her shoulders. From this angle, I could see the slight tremor in the wide brim of her hat. She was a woman who lived for the social currency of the town, and in one high-definition frame, I had devalued her entire treasury. Leo began his speech. He didn't acknowledge the images behind him. He didn't have to. The contrast between his composed, articulate delivery and the evidence of domestic malice displayed on the screen created a cognitive dissonance that the audience was currently struggling to resolve. People were whispering, their heads swiveling between the podium and the section where the family of the valedictorian sat. I looked away from Lydia and scanned the VIP section. There sat Marcus, my former business partner, leaning forward with a look of intense discomfort. Next to him was Sarah, a woman who had been Lydia's confidant during the divorce, the one who had helped her hide assets by funneling boutique profits through a series of consulting fees. They were all part of the same interconnected web, a social ecosystem built on the assumption that I was too detached, too focused on my blueprints and site surveys to notice the erosion they were causing. I had been documenting them for 18 months. Every accidental omission of financial data, every coordinated effort to exclude me from community boards, every whisper designed to paint me as the cold, robotic father while Lydia played the victim. I had the logs, I had the timestamps, I had the receipts. The ceremony ended with a perfunctory round of applause that felt brittle. As the graduates tossed their caps, the usual jubilant chaos was replaced by a strange, glancing energy. People weren't rushing to congratulate Leo. They were rushing to get close enough to see Lydia's reaction. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. I moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who knows the exits of every building he enters. I didn't head for Leo. He knew the plan. He was to head straight to the parking lot and meet me at the secondary location. Instead, I looped around the back of the bleachers, cutting through the shadows of the stadium's steel underbelly. I found myself standing near the equipment entrance just as Lydia emerged from the stands. She was alone. Her friends had miraculously vanished, absorbed into the crowd like water into sand. When she saw me, her face underwent a rapid series of transformations. Shock, then fury, and finally a desperate attempt at her usual performative indignation. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with a frequency that would have shattered glass if it had any real power behind it. "You humiliated him. On his day, you put that nonsense on the screen. Do you have any idea what you've done to his reputation?" I looked at her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I didn't put nonsense on the screen, Lydia. I put the truth on the screen. The reputation you're worried about isn't Leo's. He's the victim of a dog that doesn't exist. He's the valedictorian who overcame a bizarre act of sabotage to give a brilliant speech. No, the reputation currently being dismantled is yours." "It was an accident," she stammered, her eyes darting around to see if anyone was listening. "I told you. The fabric caught on something. I was trying to protect him from the stress." "You were trying to keep him in that house," I interrupted. "You were trying to ensure he didn't leave for the university in the fall because once he's gone, your child support ends. And your boutiques, which are currently 3 months behind on rent, will finally collapse. You needed him to fail so you could keep him as a tether to my bank account." The color drained from her face, leaving her looking older, the mask of the boutique owner finally slipping. "You've been spying on me." "I've been observing," I corrected. "I'm an architect. If I see a crack in the foundation, I don't ignore it. I measure it. I track its growth. I determine the cause." I stepped closer, just enough to enter her personal space without touching her. "This was just the beginning, Lydia. You coordinated with Marcus to stall the City Hall project last year. You told Sarah that I was mentally unstable during the mediation. You thought I was too busy looking at buildings to see the people inside them. You were wrong." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the heat of the asphalt. I drove to the office of the principal, Arthur Miller. He was waiting for me, looking deeply concerned. The school board would be calling him within the hour, demanding an explanation for the unauthorized media displayed during the ceremony. "Silas," he said as I entered. "That was That was a very bold choice. The technicians are saying it was an override. I have to report this. I know you do, Arthur, I said, sitting down across from him. I placed a folder on his desk. But before you do, I think you should see the documentation regarding the sponsorship of the new athletic wing. As you know, my firm is the primary donor. I've been reviewing the contractor bids you accepted last month. Miller froze. What are you talking about? The bids for the HVAC systems, I said, my voice as dry as parchment. They were awarded to a firm owned by Sarah's brother, a firm that quoted 30% above market rate. I have the comparative analysis right here. It looks like a kickback scheme, Arthur, and unfortunately the emails I've recovered, which were sent to my firm by a concerned whistleblower, imply that you were aware of the discrepancy. I wasn't lying. I had been sitting on that information for 6 months, waiting for the right moment to use it as a structural reinforcement. Miller's hands began to shake as he leafed through the papers. Silas, I didn't have a choice. The budget was tight, and they promised a rebate to the scholarship fund. I don't care about the reasons, I said. I care about the result. Here is what is going to happen. You are going to tell the board that the media glitch was a technical error caused by the new system's software. You will blame the firm that installed the scoreboard. You will not mention me, and you will certainly not mention Leo. And the contractor bids? Miller whispered. You will cancel the contract with Sarah's brother. You will reopen the bidding process. My firm will oversee the selection this time for a nominal fee of $1. This way the school gets a fair price and you get to keep your job. I stood up. I'm not a cruel man, Arthur. I just dislike inefficiency. And I dislike people who use their positions to facilitate the sabotage of others. As I left the school, I felt the first real sense of momentum. This wasn't just about the gown. The gown was the entry point, the small flaw that allowed me to peel back the layers of the entire structure. I met Leo at a quiet diner on the edge of the industrial district. He was sitting in a booth, the black gown folded neatly beside him. He looked up as I slid in across from him. How did she take it? He asked. She's currently trying to find a way to blame the air, I said. But it doesn't matter. The social circle she relies on is already beginning to distance itself. By tomorrow, the story won't be about your speech. It will be about the note. The town loves a tragedy, but they love a scandal even more. What's next? I looked at him. Truly looked at him. He was the only thing I had ever built that wasn't made of stone or steel. Next, we secure your future. I've already moved the remainder of your college fund into a private trust that your mother cannot access. And tomorrow, I'm having a meeting with Marcus. The business partner? The former partner, I corrected. He's been trying to buy me out of the firm for a fraction of the value. He thinks I'm distracted. He thinks I'm weak because I didn't fight back during the divorce. I'm going to show him that I wasn't being weak. I was just waiting for the concrete to set. I reached into my bag and pulled out a digital tablet. I swiped through a series of spreadsheets and architectural drawings. He's been skimming from the municipal projects. He's been using low-grade materials and the foundations of the new low-income housing units and pocketing the difference. It's a classic move, simple, greedy, and incredibly easy to prove if you know where the sensors are located. Leo leaned forward. You're going to destroy him too? I'm going to hold him accountable, I said. In my world, if you build a building that falls down, you don't get a second chance. Marcus has been building a life on a foundation of lies. I'm just the one who's going to point out the structural integrity is zero. I felt a cold thrill of anticipation. The graduation was the spark, but the fire was going to be much larger than Lydia could have imagined. It would consume the boutique, the partnership, and every person who had stood by and watched as they tried to dismantle my life. I paid the check, and we walked out into the cooling afternoon. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, sharp shadows across the parking lot. Go home, Leo. Pack your things. You're staying with me from now on. I've already had the locks changed on the townhouse, and I've hired a private security firm to monitor the perimeter. Not because I think she'll do anything physical, but because I want her to know that she is no longer welcome in our space. She's going to come after you, Dad. She won't go quietly. I'm counting on it, I said. The more she fights, the more she reveals. And I have a lot of storage space for the evidence. I watched him drive away, then I sat in my car for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote 3 names, Lydia, Marcus, Sarah. I drew a line through the first one. Not because she was finished, but because she was no longer a threat. She was now a variable I had under control. I started the car and headed toward the industrial district. I had a meeting with a former site foreman who had been fired by Marcus 6 months ago. He had stories to tell, and I had the means to make those stories very, very public. The reckoning was no longer a plan. It was a process. And as any architect will tell you, once the demolition begins, there is no stopping it until the ground is clear. The industrial district at dusk was a study in monochromatic decay. The orange glow of the sodium lamps fought against the encroaching purple of the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the corrugated metal siding of the warehouses. This was the part of the city where the gloss of the college town fell away, revealing the rusted machinery that actually kept the local economy moving. It was also where Marcus kept his secondary equipment yard, a place far removed from the polished glass and mahogany of our shared architectural firm. I parked my sedan a block away and walked the rest of the distance. My shoes crunched on gravel and broken glass. I wasn't here to hide. I was here to verify. In my pocket, I carried a small, high-intensity flashlight and a handheld ultrasonic thickness gauge. Architecture is often romanticized as an art of vision, but in reality, it is a science of measurement. If the measurements are wrong, the art is a lie. I reached the chain-link fence. The gate was secured with a heavy chain, but the gap between the poles was wide enough for a man who kept himself in shape. I slipped through, the cold metal snagging briefly on my jacket. The yard was filled with stacks of rebar, pallets of concrete mix, and several idling pieces of heavy machinery. According to the records I had quietly retrieved from our firm's server, this yard was the staging area for the Vista Heights housing project, a municipal contract Marcus had managed while I was tied up in the divorce proceedings. On paper, we were using grade 60 reinforcing steel and a high-performance concrete mix designed for seismic resilience. But the foreman I had met with earlier that afternoon, a man named Henderson, who had been discarded by Marcus for asking too many questions, had told a different story. I approached a stack of rebar covered by a tattered blue tarp. I pulled the plastic back. Under the beam of my flashlight, the steel looked correct at a glance. However, when I ran the thickness gauge along the circumference of the rods, the digital readout flickered. It wasn't grade 60, it was a cheaper, thinner imported variety, coated in a dark epoxy to mimic the appearance of the higher grade material. I took a series of photographs, ensuring the manufacturer's stamp was visible. This was the evidence of the skim. Marcus was charging the city for premium materials and installing substandard substitutes, pocketing the price difference, a difference that amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars across a project the size of Vista Heights. As I was finishing my documentation, the sound of a car engine approaching made me freeze. I doused my light. A black SUV pulled into the yard, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. It stopped near the main office trailer. Marcus stepped out. He looked agitated, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He wasn't alone. Sarah followed him out of the car, her heels clicking sharply on the packed earth. "I'm telling you, he knows." Sarah's voice carried clearly in the still night air. She sounded frantic, a sharp contrast to the composed woman I had seen at the graduation ceremony only hours ago. "The way he looked at the stands, Marcus, that thing with the screen, that wasn't for Leo. That was a warning. If he knows about the boutique's books, he knows about the Vista Heights invoices." Marcus slammed the car door. "He knows nothing. Silas is a dreamer. He spends his time calculating wind loads and worrying about the aesthetic of a staircase. He's not a forensic accountant. He's probably just lashing out because he's bitter about the divorce." "He's not bitter, Marcus. He's precise," Sarah countered. "The note on the screen? That was a surgical strike. He didn't yell, he didn't make a scene. He just showed everyone who Lydia really is. If he does that to us..." "He won't," Marcus snapped. "Because if he touches me, he touches the firm. Half of his own net worth is tied up in those contracts. He'd be bankrupting himself to get to me. He's too rational for that." I watched them from the shadows of a cement mixer. Marcus's arrogance was his greatest structural flaw. He assumed that, because I valued order and logic, I would always prioritize my own financial preservation over the necessity of a reckoning. He didn't understand that once a structure is compromised, the only responsible act is a controlled demolition. I waited until they entered the trailer before I made my move. I didn't leave the yard. Instead, I walked over to Marcus's SUV. It was a brand new luxury model, a visible manifestation of the money he had skimmed from the city's housing budget. I didn't slash the tires or break the glass. Those were the acts of a common vandal. Instead, I took out a small vial of a specialized industrial solvent I had acquired from a masonry restoration site. I applied a thin, clear line of the liquid to the door handles and the window seals. It wouldn't do anything immediately, but within 48 hours, the solvent would react with the clear coat and the rubber, causing the paint to bubble and the seals to warp and crack, effectively ruining the exterior finish of the vehicle. It was a slow, creeping degradation, much like the way Marcus had treated our partnership. I slipped back through the fence and returned to my car. My heart was steady. The internal commentary that usually analyzed blueprints was now analyzing the trajectory of the coming week. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. Our firm occupied the top floor of a restored textile mill, all exposed brick and polished steel. It was a space I had designed to evoke transparency and strength. Marcus arrived an hour later, looking like he hadn't slept. He walked past my office, then paused and doubled back. "Silas," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Quite a show yesterday. A bit dramatic, don't you think? Poor Lydia is a wreck." I didn't look up from the monitor. "Lydia is an adult who made a series of choices, Marcus. I simply provided the platform for those choices to be acknowledged." Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Look, I get it. You're angry, but don't let your personal issues spill over into the business. I heard you were talking to Miller about the athletic wing. You shouldn't be interfering with my project leads." "Interfering?" I finally looked at him. My expression was as neutral as a slab of unpolished marble. I was ensuring the integrity of the firm's reputation, using a contractor with a history of inflated bids as a liability, Marcus. I cleared it up for you. Marcus's jaw tightened. "I had that under control. You're making waves where there don't need to be any. Just stick to the design side, Silas. Leave the management to me." "I think I've left the management to you for long enough," I said quietly. "In fact, I've spent the morning reviewing the Vista Heights files. There are some discrepancies in the material orders. I'd like to see the original manufacturer certificates for the rebar." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus didn't move. He didn't blink. The air in the office suddenly felt very thin. "The certificates are in the archive," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave. "I'll have Sarah find them for you later this week." "I don't want Sarah to find them. I want you to go to the cabinet right now and hand them to me." "Are you questioning my integrity, Silas?" "I'm questioning the measurements, Marcus. In this office, those are the same thing." Marcus took a step toward my desk. He was a larger man than I was, accustomed to using his physical presence to intimidate site workers and junior architects. He leaned over, placing his hands on the mahogany surface. "You're on very thin ice. You've already alienated your ex-wife and half the school board. If you start a fight here, you'll be the one who loses. I have the board's support. You're just the guy who draws the lines." I didn't flinch. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a single photograph I had taken the night before, the digital readout of the thickness gauge against the substandard steel. I placed it on the desk between his hands. "The lines I draw are supported by the steel I specify," I said. "This steel doesn't support anything. It's a fraud, Marcus. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, a copy of this photo, along with the GPS coordinates of your equipment yard, was sent to the city's building inspector via an anonymous tip." Marcus recoiled as if the photograph were hot to the touch. You didn't." "I did. They'll be at the yard by noon. I imagine they'll want to do a full audit of all the Vista Heights materials. If I were you, I'd start looking for a very good attorney. Though given your recent spending habits, I wonder if you can afford one." Marcus's face turned a mottled, angry purple. He looked like he wanted to reach across the desk and grab me, but he knew the building was full of witnesses. He knew my reputation for precision meant that if I was making an accusation, I already had the proof to back it up. "You're burning it all down," he whispered. "You're destroying the firm." "No," I said, standing up and putting on my jacket. "I'm clearing the site. You can't build something permanent on a foundation of rot, Marcus. I tried to tell you that for years. You just weren't listening." I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his as I left the office. I didn't look back. I had a lunch meeting with the relative who had stayed neutral during the divorce. The cousin who had accepted a lucrative position at Marcus's firm in exchange for keeping Lydia informed of my legal strategies. The strategy was simple: isolate, expose, and remove. I was moving through the list with the efficiency of a demolition crew. By the time the sun set on the city tonight, Marcus would be under investigation, Sarah would be panicking about the boutique's hidden ledgers, and Lydia would be finding out that her social invitations had been revoked. I walked out into the bright morning light, the city sounds humming around me. I felt a strange, quiet calm. It wasn't joy. I didn't have room for such a messy emotion. It was the satisfaction of a blueprint finally becoming a reality. The people who had sought to sabotage my life had forgotten one fundamental rule. I was the one who knew how the whole thing was put together, and I was the only one who knew which piece to pull to make it all come crashing down. The midday heat shimmered over the polished hood of my car as I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet upscale bistro on the edge of the university district. This was neutral ground, or so my cousin Julian believed. Julian worked as a junior estimator for Marcus, a position he had secured right around the time my divorce papers were filed. He was the relative who had mastered the art of the sympathetic nod while simultaneously scanning my desk for any leverage Lydia could use in court. In the architecture of a betrayal, people like Julian are the termites, small, quiet, and capable of hollowing out a structure from the inside without ever making a sound. I saw him through the glass of the restaurant window. He was checking his watch, his movements jittery. He knew the news about the graduation ceremony. He likely knew about the building inspectors descending on Marcus's equipment yard. The neutrality he had maintained was becoming an expensive luxury. I entered and sat across from him. I didn't order food. I simply placed my phone on the table, screen down. "Silas," Julian said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about yesterday. That was quite a statement. Lydia is calling everyone, crying about how you've ruined her reputation. She says you're having some kind of episode." "Is that what she says?" I asked, my voice flat. "And what do you say, Julian? When you're giving her updates on my firm's internal projections, do you tell her I'm having an episode, or do you tell her I'm being thorough?" Julian's face turned a dull, waxy gray. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've stayed out of it. Family is family." "Family is a social contract based on mutual structural integrity," I said. "You broke that contract the moment you started BCCing Lydia on my private correspondence regarding the property settlement. I've had a digital forensic team tracking the metadata on our server for months. Every document you leaked, every strategy you whispered to Sarah, I have the trail." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a level that barely cleared the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Marcus is going to lose his license. By the end of the week, the city will move to debar him from all municipal work. When the investigation expands, they're going to look at the estimators. They're going to ask who signed off on the fictitious material orders for Vista Heights. Your signature is on those digital logs, Julian." Julian began to stammer, his hands fumbling with a napkin. "I was just doing what Marcus told me. I'm an employee, Silas. I don't have the authority to—" "You have the authority to tell the truth," I interrupted. "But you chose the salary Marcus offered instead. You chose the neutrality that paid for that new luxury apartment. But here's the problem with being neutral. When the building collapses, the people in the middle get crushed first." I pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a draft of a whistleblower statement. "You are going to sign this. You are going to provide a detailed account of how Marcus instructed you to falsify the steel grade reports. If you do this, I will ensure that my firm, under my sole leadership, does not pursue you for damages. If you don't, you will be the primary scapegoat for a multi-million-dollar fraud case." "Silas, please," he whispered. "Lydia will lose everything if the firm goes under. She's counting on my position to help her bridge the gap with the boutique." "Lydia's boutiques are built on a foundation of air and vanity," I said. "She isn't your concern anymore. Your concern is whether or not you want to spend the next 5 years in a courtroom. Sign the paper, Julian, or don't. I have enough evidence to bury Marcus regardless. Your signature just determines if you're in the hole with him." I watched him pick up the pen. His hand was shaking so violently that the signature was nearly illegible, but it was there. I took the paper, folded it, and placed it in my breast pocket. "I'll see you at the office," I said. "Actually, no. Don't bother coming back. Your personal effects will be couriered to your apartment by 5. I left the restaurant before the waiter could even bring the water. The next phase required a different kind of movement. I drove back to my townhouse, but I didn't go inside. Instead, I went to the detached garage where I kept my drafting table and my private files. I spent the next 4 hours orchestrating a series of strategic leaks. I wasn't using social media. That was Lydia's playground, a place of noise and emotion. I was using the professional networks. I sent a series of detailed anonymous emails to the primary suppliers of Lydia's boutiques, informing them of her recent credit defaults and her pending litigation. I attached the public filings for her rent arrears. By tomorrow morning, every designer she carried would be demanding upfront payment or pulling their stock from her shelves. Then I turned my attention to Sarah. She was the one who had helped Lydia hide the cash. I knew Sarah's husband was a quiet, unassuming man who valued his position at the university above all else. I sent him a single, physical envelope via a private courier. Inside was a ledger showing the consulting fees Sarah had been receiving from Lydia, fees that had never been reported on their joint tax returns. It wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of disclosure. If she wanted to participate in the dismantling of my family, she had to be prepared for the scrutiny of her own. As the sun began to set, casting a long, sharp shadow across my drafting table, I felt the shift in the atmosphere. The pressure was building. I could almost hear the groans of the social and professional structures I was undermining. Around 8:01 p.m., my phone began to ring. It was Lydia. I let it go to voicemail, then it was Marcus, then Sarah. The frantic nature of the calls told me the leaks were working. The narrative they had constructed, the one where I was the cold, distant figure who could be easily manipulated, was being replaced by a reality they couldn't comprehend. I decided it was time for a site visit. I drove to Lydia's house, the house I had once renovated with such care. I didn't go to the door. I sat in the car at the curb, watching the lights in the windows. I saw her pacing in the living room, her silhouette sharp against the curtains. She was on the phone, her gestures animated and jagged. She looked like a woman who was realizing that the floor beneath her was no longer solid. I stepped out of the car. I walked up the driveway, not toward the house, but toward the side garden. There was a large, decorative stone fountain that Lydia had insisted on installing during the divorce, a piece of vanity that cost more than Leo's first 2 years of tuition. I had always hated it. It was a heavy, ostentatious thing that didn't fit the lines of the property. I carried a heavy-duty wrench in my hand. I reached behind the fountain to the main water valve. With a slow, deliberate twist, I didn't just turn it off. I stripped the valve stem entirely. Then I loosened the pressure coupling on the main intake line. The water began to spray, a quiet, insistent hiss in the night. It wasn't a flood yet, but by morning the garden would be a swamp, and the foundation of the terrace she loved so much would be undermined. It was a small act of property damage, symbolic and contained. It was a physical manifestation of what I was doing to her life, a slow, unstoppable erosion from a source she couldn't see and didn't know how to fix. "Silas?" The voice came from the darkness near the porch. It was Sarah. She must have been there, hiding from the calls, seeking refuge with Lydia. She stepped into the light of the garden lamp, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "Lydia is a mess. She says you're stalking her. She's going to call the police." "Let her," I said, not looking up from the valve. "The police deal in law, Sarah. I deal in consequences. Did your husband enjoy the mail today?" She flinched as if I had struck her. "You're a monster. You're destroying everything because you're hurt. Because of a divorce?" "I'm not hurt," I said, finally standing and wiping the grease from my hands with a cloth. "And this isn't about the divorce. It's about the fact that you all thought you could build your happiness on the wreckage of mine. You thought I was a component you could discard. But I'm the architect, Sarah. I'm the one who knows where the weight is distributed." I walked toward her, my footsteps heavy on the gravel. She backed away, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I didn't touch her. I didn't need to. The sheer weight of my presence, the absolute certainty in my eyes, was enough to make her stumble. "Tell Lydia that the water is rising," I said, "and tell her that tomorrow I'm coming for the boutiques." I walked back to my car, leaving her standing by the hissing fountain. As I drove away, I saw the front door of the house fly open. Lydia ran out, screaming something I couldn't hear. She looked small in the rearview mirror, a frantic figure silhouetted by the lights of a home that was no longer hers in any way that mattered. I checked my internal checklist. Lydia, socially isolated, financially cornered. Marcus, professionally ruined, legally exposed. Sarah, domestically compromised. Julian, neutralized. There was one more sequence to execute. A public convergence. A moment where all the disparate threads of their betrayals would be pulled tight at once. I needed a venue where they couldn't run, where the witnesses would be the very people they spent their lives trying to impress. I looked at the schedule for the local Chamber of Commerce gala, happening in 2 days. Marcus was slated to receive an award for urban development. It was the perfect venue. The blueprints for the final confrontation were already drawn. I just had to wait for the concrete to cure. I returned to my townhouse and found Leo in the kitchen, eating a bowl of cereal. He looked up, his expression guarded but no longer afraid. "Is it over?" he asked. "No," I said, sitting down across from him. "But the structure is failing. Every beam is groaning, Leo. Can you hear it?" He listened for a moment to the silence of the house, then nodded slowly. "I can hear it, Dad." "Good," I said, "because on Friday the whole thing comes down." The morning of the Chamber of Commerce gala arrived with a relentless, slate-gray sky that matched the mood of the city's professional elite. For 2 days, the rumors had been circulating like a slow-acting toxin through the local network. People thrive on the collapse of others, provided that collapse happens in a way that allows them to feel superior. Marcus was no longer the golden boy of urban development. He was a liability. Lydia was no longer the charming face of local retail. She was a cautionary tale of credit defaults and domestic instability. I spent the morning in my study, finalizing the logistics. I had already secured Leo's departure. I had driven him to the airport myself, watching as he boarded a flight to his summer internship out of state. He was out of the blast radius, safe behind a wall of distance and new beginnings. As he left, he didn't ask me to be merciful. He simply thanked me for the gown. I received a phone call at noon from Sarah. She was no longer hysterical. She sounded hollowed out. "He's leaving me, Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband. He can't look at me without seeing that ledger. He says he doesn't know who I am." He knows exactly who you are now, Sarah, I replied, my voice devoid of inflection. That's the problem. You spent years curating a facade. I just removed the paint. Why didn't you just talk to us? Why this calculated destruction? I am an architect, I said, a familiar refrain that had become my mantra. I don't negotiate with dry rot. I don't bargain with a cracked foundation. I observe the failure and I rectify the site. You participated in the erosion of my family for your own social standing. Now you can experience what it's like to stand on shifting ground. I hung up. There was no anger left in me, only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a plan reaching its final phase. By 7:20 p.m., I was standing in the foyer of the Grand Hotel. The ballroom was a cavernous space of gold leaf and crystal, filled with the hum of 100 conversations. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my posture upright, my expression as unreadable as a blank blueprint. I was the ghost at the feast, the man everyone was whispering about, but no one dared to approach. I saw Marcus near the bar. He looked haggard. The luxury SUV I had treated with solvent was parked out front, and even in the dim light of the valet stand, the bubbling paint on the door handles had been visible. He was nursing a drink, his eyes darting toward the entrance every time the doors opened. He was waiting for the building inspectors to go public, but I had timed the release of the whistleblower statement to hit the local news cycle at exactly 8:30 p.m., the moment he was scheduled to take the stage for his award. Lydia arrived 10 minutes later. She was wearing a dress that looked expensive but sat poorly on her frame, as if she had lost weight too quickly. She tried to walk with her usual confidence, but the way people leaned away from her as she passed was unmistakable. She was a social pariah, and she knew it. When she saw me, she stopped. For a moment, I thought she might create a scene, but the presence of the city's power brokers acted as a restraint. She simply glared at me with a look of concentrated resentment that would have unnerved a lesser man. I moved through the crowd, nodding to colleagues and clients. I was gathering the witnesses. I stopped to speak with the city attorney, a man I had known for 15 years. Silas, he said, lowering his voice, I've heard some troubling things about the Vista Heights project. There's a rumor that the structural reports were imaginative. I've heard the same, David, I said calmly. In fact, I believe the building department is issuing a stop work order as we speak. It's a shame. Such a prominent project. It reflects poorly on the firm. It reflects poorly on Marcus, the attorney corrected. The word is you've been conducting an internal audit. I believe in transparency, I said. The city deserves what it pays for. As 8:00 p.m. approached, the guests began to take their seats. I had arranged for a specific table near the front, directly in the line of sight of the podium. I sat alone, a singular point of stillness in the room. The ceremony began with the usual platitudes. The mayor spoke about growth, about the future, about the visionaries who were shaping our skyline. I watched Marcus as he sat at the head table. He was sweating despite the air conditioning. He kept checking his phone under the table. He was likely seeing the first tremors of the news breaking online. And now, the mayor announced, for our final award of the evening, for excellence in urban development, we honor Marcus Thorne. The applause was polite but notably thin. Marcus stood up, his legs looking unsteady. He walked toward the podium, a forced smile plastered on his face. As he reached the microphone, he looked out at the audience, and his eyes found mine. I didn't smile. I didn't toast him. I simply stared at him, the embodiment of the consequence he had tried so hard to avoid. Before he could speak, the large screens on either side of the stage, the ones meant to show a montage of his achievements, flickered. It wasn't a montage of buildings. It was a series of side-by-side comparisons. On the left, the invoices Marcus had submitted to the city. On the right, the actual delivery receipts for the substandard steel. Below them, in bold, clear text, was the whistleblower statement signed by Julian. The images cycled every 5 seconds. The falsified reports, the photos of the epoxy-coated rebar, and finally, a copy of the boutique's hidden ledgers that Sarah had helped Lydia manage. The room went into a state of total, absolute shock. There was no gasping, no shouting, just a profound, heavy silence as the elite of the city read the evidence of a multi-million-dollar fraud while the perpetrator stood at the podium. Marcus turned to look at the screen, his face draining of color until he was the shade of uncurled parchment. He tried to speak, but the microphone seemed to have lost its power. I had ensured the AV technician, the same one from the graduation, followed the script. Lydia stood up from her table, her chair screeching against the parquet floor. "This is a lie!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "He's doing this. He's crazy." But nobody was looking at her. They were looking at the documents. They were looking at the reality of the theft. I stood up slowly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence in the room was so deep that even a whisper would have carried. "The measurements don't lie, Marcus," I said. The mayor stepped away from the podium, looking at Marcus with a mixture of horror and disgust. Two men in dark suits, who had been waiting near the back of the room, representatives from the state attorney's office I had briefed that morning, began to move down the center aisle. Marcus didn't run. He didn't fight. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the entire structure of his life had been built on a sinkhole and the ground had finally given way. He slumped against the podium, the gold award clattering to the floor. Lydia tried to reach him, but the crowd surged back, creating a vacuum around them. She looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, a supporter, a peer. She found nothing but the cold, judgmental stares of the people she had spent years trying to impress. She saw Sarah sitting at a far table, head in her hands, already a ghost. I walked toward the exit. I had no desire to witness the tawdry details of the police intervention. I had designed the collapse. I didn't need to stay for the cleanup. As I reached the doors, Lydia intercepted me. She was shaking, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You've destroyed us," she hissed. "You've taken everything. What do you have left? You're alone in that house with your notebooks and your drawings. Was it worth it?" I looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt a genuine sense of peace. "I'm not alone, Lydia. I have the truth, and unlike the life you built, the truth doesn't require a maintenance budget." I stepped out into the cool night air. The rain had started, a fine mist that washed the city's grime into the gutters. I walked to my car, the sound of my footsteps rhythmic and sure. Behind me, the Grand Hotel was a hive of scandal and ruin, but in front of me, the road was clear. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my notebook. I turned to the page with the names: Lydia, line through; Marcus, line through; Sarah, line through; Julian, line through. The audit was complete. The site was cleared. I started the engine and drove toward the townhouse. I had work to do. There were new blueprints to draw, new structures to conceive, ones built on solid ground with materials that could withstand the pressure of the world. The story of the architect and the saboteurs was over. The reconstruction was about to begin. I didn't look back at the lights of the hotel. I didn't look back at the wreckage. I simply drove into the dark, a man who had finally finished the job he was born to do. The day after the gala, the city felt different. To most, the air was simply heavy with the humidity of a lingering summer storm, but to me, the atmosphere had finally achieved a state of equilibrium. The frantic, uneven vibrations of the last few years had smoothed out into a low, steady hum. I sat in my home office, the windows open to the sound of the rain hitting the slate roof. My desk was clear, save for a single black pen and a legal pad. The morning news had been a clinical exercise in reporting the obvious. The headlines detailed the stunning fall of a local titan and the financial irregularities that had shuttered 3 high-end boutiques overnight. There was no mention of a vengeful husband or a bitter architect. The narrative had shifted entirely to the cold, hard facts of the fraud. The community was not mourning a loss. They were analyzing a failure. A knock at the door startled the silence. I wasn't expecting guests. I had already deactivated the alarm system's perimeter chime. I no longer felt the need to monitor every approach with the intensity of a sentry. I walked to the door and opened it to find Marcus standing on the porch. He looked as though he had been weathered by a decade in the span of 12 hours. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were sunken, and the arrogance that usually served as his exoskeleton had vanished, leaving something soft and unprotected. He didn't try to push his way in. He stood in the rain, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "The bank froze the firm's accounts this morning," Marcus said. His voice was a raspy imitation of the booming baritone he used to command boardrooms. "They're calling in the loans on the Vista Heights equipment. The city is preparing a civil suit. I'm finished, Silas. There isn't enough left of my reputation to buy a cup of coffee." "Reputation is a speculative asset, Marcus," I said, leaning against the door frame. "You traded yours for a series of short-term gains. You shouldn't be surprised when the market corrects itself." "I did it for the firm," he lied, though the lie sounded exhausted even to him. "I did it to keep us competitive. You were so busy with your purity of design that you didn't see the margins shrinking. I was just trying to balance the scales." "You weren't balancing scales. You were hollowing out the beams," I replied. "You assumed I was too distracted to notice the structural integrity of my own business. That was your mistake. You confused my silence for ignorance." Marcus looked at the townhouse behind me, his eyes lingering on the clean, modern lines of the hallway. "Lydia is at the house, or what's left of it. The sheriff served an eviction notice because the boutique's debt was cross-collateralized with the mortgage. She has 48 hours to pack. She's not doing well, Silas. She keeps saying you're the one who failed, that you broke the family first by being so unreachable." I felt a brief flash of the old sarcasm, but it passed quickly, replaced by a profound indifference. Lydia's version of the truth has always been a flexible thing. She believes a home is a stage. I believe a home is a foundation. When she decided to use our son as a prop in her play, she ensured the stage would eventually collapse. You can tell her that if you like, though I doubt she'll find the architectural metaphor helpful. What now? Marcus asked, his shoulders slumping. You won. You've got the firm, or what's left of it. You've got the house. You've got the moral high ground. Are you happy? Happiness is a volatile emotion, Marcus. I prefer satisfaction, and I'm not finished. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. It was the key to the firm's secondary storage unit, where the original, unaltered blueprints for every project we had ever touched were kept. The firm is being dissolved. I filed the paperwork this morning. I'm starting a new practice, one that bears only my name. I've already contacted the city. I'm going to oversee the remediation of Vista Heights at cost. I'm going to replace every inch of that substandard steel with what was actually specified. Marcus stared at the key. You're going to spend your own money to fix a project that's already been discredited? Why? Because the building needs to stand, Marcus. That is the only thing that matters in the end. Not the awards, not the profit, and certainly not you. I closed the door before he could respond. I didn't need to hear his apologies or his justifications. They were noise, and I had spent enough of my life filtering out the static. I returned to my office and checked my email. There was a message from Leo. It was short, sent from his university account. Settled in? The campus is beautiful. Everything here is built of stone. It feels solid. Thanks, Dad. I looked at the screen for a long time. That was the only recognition I required. I had cleared the path for him, removed the obstacles that had been quietly placed in his way by the people who claimed to love him. He was free to build his own life now, on a site that wasn't contaminated by the resentment of his parents. The rest of the morning was spent in a series of digital executions. I authorized the final transfer of funds to the designers Lydia had defrauded, using the contingency account I had quietly built up over the years for exactly this purpose. It wasn't an act of charity toward her. It was a way to ensure that the fallout didn't touch the innocent workers who depended on those contracts. I then sent a formal letter to the university board, detailing the full extent of the academic sabotage Lydia had attempted, ensuring that Leo's scholarship remained secure regardless of the scandal surrounding his parents. Around 2 p.m., the rain stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, hitting the wet pavement with a blinding brilliance. I decided to walk to the firm's office one last time. The building was quiet. The staff had been sent home with severance packages I had personally guaranteed. The drafting tables were covered in plastic sheets, and the large-scale models of our projects sat like ghost cities in the dim light. I walked to the window and looked out at the skyline. I could see the cranes of the Vista Heights project in the distance, frozen against the blue sky. I sat at my desk and opened the master ledger. There were 4 names on my list. I had already crossed out 3. I looked at the 4th. Lydia. She wasn't just a name on a page. She was the person I had shared 15 years of my life with. But as I looked at the name now, I didn't see a wife or a mother or even an enemy. I saw a failed specification, a component that had been integrated into the design without proper testing, leading to a slow, systemic failure of the entire assembly. The phone on my desk rang. It was the private line, the one only she had the number for. I answered it. Silas, she said. She wasn't yelling anymore. She sounded small, the way Leo had sounded on the morning of his graduation. They're here. The movers. They're taking the piano. My mother gave me that piano. The piano was purchased with a business loan from the boutique, Lydia. The boutique is insolvent. The bank is merely recovering its assets. How can you be so cold? She whispered. I loved you once. We had a life. We had a structure, I corrected. And you spent years chipping away at the load-bearing walls because you didn't like the color of the paint. You thought you could remove the supports and the roof would stay up out of sheer habit. That isn't how the world works. I have nowhere to go, Silas. You have the apartment in the city, I said. The one you bought with the consulting fees you hid from the court. I didn't report that account to the bank. I left it for you. It isn't much, but it's enough for a new start, provided you learn how to live within the dimensions of your own reality. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, a ragged, uneven sound. You knew? You knew about that account the whole time? I know everything that happens on my sites, Lydia. I always have. I hung up. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt the quiet, heavy click of a lock falling into place. I picked up the black pen and drew a slow, deliberate line through her name. The ink was dark and permanent. The audit was finished. Every discrepancy had been accounted for. Every debt had been settled. Every structural flaw had been exposed and addressed. I stood up and walked to the door of the office. I didn't take anything with me. I didn't need the awards on the wall or the framed photographs of finished buildings. I had the knowledge of how to build something better. I turned off the lights. The office plunged into a cool, gray shadow. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the brick walls, a sound of movement and intent. I walked out of the building and into the bright afternoon sun. I reached the sidewalk and paused, looking at my watch. It was exactly 4 p.m. At this moment, the first of the new steel shipments was being unloaded at the Vista Heights site. The reconstruction had begun. I started walking toward my car. I didn't look back at the textile mill. I didn't think about Marcus or Sarah or the ruins of the life I had once known. I thought about the weight of the stone on Leo's campus. I thought about the clean, white space of a fresh sheet of drafting paper. I reached my car and sat inside, the interior smelling of leather and rain. I looked at my hands. They were steady, the fingers poised as if holding a scale ruler. I started the engine and pulled out into the flow of traffic, moving forward with the precise, calculated momentum of a man who finally understood that the most important thing an architect can build is a life that cannot be sabotaged. The city moved around me, a chaotic assembly of people and plans, but I was no longer part of the noise. I was the one who drew the lines. And as I drove over the bridge and toward the horizon, I knew that for the first time in my life, the lines were perfectly straight.